When we think of history's most notorious genocides, most people would think of the Holocaust, the Rwandan genocide, or maybe the Armenian genocide. But what if I told you that during the same era, one country was responsible for multiple genocides that claimed the lives of tens of millions across Asia? When we talk about Japan during World War II, what images come to mind? For most, it's probably the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Others might think of the rape of Nanking, Comfort Woman, or the horrific human experience of Unit 731. But as horrific as these events were, they represent only a fraction of Japan's war crimes, and the conversations about them have been carefully controlled by Japan's ruling elite to the point where Hello Kitty, anime, and other cultural exports have sanitized Japan's brutal past. In this video, I want to shed light on these lesser-known atrocities, revealing the systematic brutality inflicted upon millions across Asia. By examining these events, we hope to honor the memories of those who suffered and ensure their stories are not forgotten. During the 1930s and 40s, Japan pursued aggressive expansion throughout Asia under the guise of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. This so-called mission to liberate Asia from Western colonialism was a cover for Japan's imperial and genocidal ambitions. It was not about partnership, but subjugation and extermination. And as Japan expanded, they engaged in systematic violence aimed at erasing entire communities. Nowhere was Japan's genocidal intent more explicit than in China. The horror reached its peak in December 1937, when Japanese forces captured the Chinese capital and unleashed one of the most infamous atrocities of the 20th century, the Nanjing Genocide. For 6 weeks, the city became a bloodbath. Mass executions, widespread rape, looting, and arson were carried out on an industrial scale. The death toll is staggering, and estimates reach up to 300,000 civilians, with countless more unaccounted for. But Nanjing was just the beginning. As Japan tightened its grip on China, the brutality escalated across the entire country. In the provinces, entire villages and civilians were wiped out. Japanese forces deployed biological weapons, poisoned water supplies, and conducted human experimentation, methods that killed hundreds of thousands in some of the earliest recorded instances of biological warfare. Meanwhile, the relentless bombing of Chongqing turned one of China's largest cities into a wasteland, with waves of air raids deliberately targeting civilians. To crush resistance, Japan escalated to total war. The policy 3 alls, kill all, burn all, loot all, was systemically carried out across occupied China. This was not a response to military opposition, but a deliberate strategy of annihilation. Even those who survived Japan's genocides were not spared. Entire generations were either exterminated or enslaved in a system designed to break China's spirit and erase its people. Vietnam was caught in a brutal tug-of-war between France and Japan. In September 1940, Japan stationed troops in Vietnam while allowing the French to retain nominal control. But this arrangement lasted until March 1945, when Japan ousted the French and declared the Empire of Vietnam. Soon after, Japan prioritized stripping Vietnam of its resources to fuel its war efforts, leaving little to nothing for the local villages to survive. Natural disasters compounded the crisis, and by 1944, Vietnam spiraled into a catastrophic famine. Entire families and villages were wiped out as the estimates climbed up to between 1 and 2 million. For the Vietnamese that survived, they were all conscripted into forced labor and sent to work camps or projects like the Death Railway. At the same time, they sought to erase Vietnam's cultural identity by replacing local customs and education with Japanese influences. National movements were brutally suppressed, and their leaders were imprisoned or killed. One of the main reasons why these countries were invaded was because of their abundant natural resources, especially rubber and tin. The Japanese imposed strict control over production and distribution, which left local communities devastated as essential goods became scarce and the civilian population faced significant increases in poverty and starvation. One of the occupation's most infamous atrocities was the Sook Ching Genocide, a Chinese term that literally means purging through cleansing. Between February and March 1942, Japanese forces systemically targeted and murdered Malaysia and Singapore's Chinese communities, as well as any Chinese civilians suspected of harboring anti-Japanese sentiments. Thousands were executed in these mass killings, with estimates of the death toll ranging from 25,000 to 50,000, and other sources claiming up to 80,000. The remaining civilians were conscripted into forced labor, subjecting them to grueling conditions on military projects such as the Death Railway. It all began with the fall of Bataan in April 1942, when approximately 76,000 Filipino and American troops were forced to surrender to the Japanese because of a shortage of supplies and weapons. What followed was the infamous Bataan Death March, a journey of over 100 km from one location to another through blistering heat. Prisoners were denied food and water, and those who collapsed were beaten, beheaded, or simply left to die in the scorching sun. This wasn't just a march, it was a genocide, and the road was littered with bodies of children. Survivors who somehow made it to the POW camps faced even more torment, and thousands died from overworking and starvation. Days after, another genocide occurred at the Bataan River, where over 400 Filipino officers and non-commissioned officers were singled out and slaughtered in cold blood. The genocides didn't end there. As American forces closed in on Manila, the Japanese army turned the city into a killing ground, where over 100,000 civilians were slaughtered. Families were dragged from their homes, children were impaled, women were raped to death, and the elderly were burned alive. Entire neighborhoods were leveled to the ground, leaving the city as nothing more than a graveyard. To Filipinos, this is remembered as the Rape of Manila, or the Manila Genocide. Then called the Dutch East Indies, this country endured a brutal Japanese occupation that implemented the Revisionism system, a form of forced labor that enslaved between 4 and 10 million Indonesians under horrific working conditions which included children. There was little to no food, proper shelter, or medical care, and many died from exhaustion, disease, or suicide. Others were sent to work in Japanese-occupied territories, including the Death Railway in Burma. Some scholars claim that the death rates in this camp alone exceeded those of Allied prisoners of war. These cases of exploitation triggered a devastating famine, especially in Java, where an estimated 3 to 4 million people died of starvation between 1944 and 45. In another city in Indonesia, the Japanese falsely claimed that all of the ethnic groups living there, as well as many opposition groups, were involved in a plot to overthrow the Japanese and create a People's Republic of West Borneo. They further claimed that the sultans, Chinese, Indonesian government officials, Indians, and Arabs, who had been antagonistic to each other, joined together to massacre Japanese. So they gathered all of these groups and massacred them. In addition to this, neighboring villages were wiped off the map and their inhabitants slaughtered in cold blood. For the ones who survived, schools were reconstructed to emphasize Japanese language and customs while suppressing local traditions. Burma was a pivotal battleground in Southeast Asia, and its people endured horrific suffering under Japanese occupation. From 1942 to 45, Japan's control brought forced labor, starvation, and widespread atrocities to a population already struggling under British colonial rule. Here, the construction of Burma Death Railway stretched 415 km through dense jungle and mountainous terrain, linking Japan's ally of Thailand to control critical war routes. Construction began in June 1942 and was completed in October 1943, a year and a half ahead of the planned 3-year schedule. This acceleration came at an unimaginable human cost as diseases like malaria, dysentery, cholera, and others ravaged the camps, killing almost everyone. It's also estimated that more than 15,000 prisoners of war and the workers who collapsed from exhaustion were beaten to death or executed. Besides the death camp, villages suspected of resisting Japanese rule, which, surprisingly to no one, was every single one, and their inhabitants were massacred in acts of collective punishment. Entire villages were wiped off the map, thousands were worked to death, and millions suffered. Long before World War II, Japan had established a dictatorship where military officials governed with an iron fist. Everything from freedom of speech, association, assembly was stripped away. Schools were destroyed and restructured. Koreans were forced to adopt Japanese names, speak Japanese, and follow Japanese customs. Economically, Japan had siphoned off all of Korea's resources and labor to support Japanese industrialization and war machine. Korean businesses were destroyed to make way for Japanese settlers and enterprises, who profited from the exploitation of the Korean people. As the war escalated, they were conscripted into forced labor, sent to work in factories, mines, and military projects under brutal and dehumanizing conditions. Hundreds of thousands died from overwork and malnutrition. To most people's knowledge, there is the event of the Comfort Women, except this time, it was the most brutal out of all the occupied territories. More than 200,000 women were abducted and coerced into sexual slavery by the Japanese military. While Japan does acknowledge this in their national conversation, it is an intentional deflection to shift the focus away from the fact that it was a genocide. While we've explored some of the main regions affected by Japan's brutal expansion during World War II, countless other territories that endured Japan's rule were not mentioned. By the war's end, Japan's expansionist campaigns had claimed between 40 to 50 million lives. Entire nations were left in ruins, generations wiped out, and yet despite the sheer magnitude of these atrocities, Japan's crimes are consistently downplayed, labeled as mere massacres, war crimes, or even worse, just incidents. Think about if Germany had taken the same approach to the Holocaust, refusing to call it a genocide, instead referring to it as just a massacre, or an unfortunate wartime event. Imagine if they taught future generations that only some war crimes had been committed, and painting themselves as victims, conveniently avoiding terms like genocide or systemic extermination.